Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll give folks a few more seconds to join and we'll get started. Great. I think we have a little bit of a critical mass. Just because we have a tight agenda, I'd like to get into welcome and introductions, but folks feel free to allow folks to jump in. Gwen, if you could do that. Great. Welcome everyone to our release webinar for a resource guide that we created for local action units. We'll be walking through some of this resource today. We'll hear from state and local partners and the resource guide demo itself for the municipalities to support the LAU administration. Just before we dive into some housekeeping things that we wanted to note, this meeting is being recorded. So if you do not feel comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera or mute yourself or the microphone. We do invite you to please take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat, your name and affiliation. And also a quick reminder to stay muted when you're not speaking. We will have some Q&A in the end, so you should be able to sort of chime in then. And feel free to use the chat for any questions that come to your mind while the presenters are presenting. So going over our agenda very quickly, we have a tight 90 minutes today. We'll be sharing some context and project overview to provide some background on why we did this project and why a resource guide like this was created. That will be followed by speaker presentations. We are grateful to have EOHLC, RHSO, as well as the City of Melrose present today. And then we'll be going into a quick demo of the resource guide or the web page that we created, followed by some highlights of recommendations that came out of the project. And then we'll have a brief Q&A portion in the end where folks can leave a question in the chat or raise their hands in that Q&A portion. And then we'll close. So beginning with some introductions, I am Sukanya Sharma. I'm the Senior Regional Land Use Planner here at MAPC, and I was the project manager of this project. And I was joined by Gwendolyn Helen Sands. She's a Regional Housing Planner too at MAPC and did a lot of the project work. We are also joined by Adam Ploetz, the Manager of Housing and Neighborhood Development on this call. When it comes to speakers, we are fortunate to be joined by 3 speakers today who bring deep experience in LAU administration and affordable housing in general. Rieko Hayashi, the Local Initiative Program Director at EOHLC, is joining us in lieu of Ali Sabatino, the LAU coordinator who was unable to make it today. We are also joined by Liz Russ, the Director of the Regional Housing Services Office, or RHSO, as well as Laurie Massa from the Director and City Planner of the City of Melrose. We are very grateful to each of them for sharing their perspectives today. So before we dive into the project context, we will be running some Zoom polls. And so I will let Gwen take over and introduce these polls while I run them in the back end.
Thanks, Sukanya. Yes, we're going to do just a couple quick questions. We're just curious about who's here today and what experience you have with LAUs. So our first Zoom poll question will be, which community do you represent or are joining us from? That should have popped up on your screen, and you should be able to just type a short answer there. Great, seeing them come in. Still going up there. All right, I think maybe we can move to the next one, Sukanya.
Mm-hmm. Um, okay. Give me 1 second. I think we're getting some technical troubles here. Great.
Right, and then our second question, yeah, it should be up. Has your community created LAUs before? So you should be able to select yes, no, not sure. Looking like the results are coming in. Okay, so it looks like from what I'm seeing, we're hovering, jumping around between 65 to 75% of folks say yes, their community has created LAUs. That's awesome. Okay, we're going down a little bit. 61, 62% yes. Around 12, 13% no, have not done LAUs, and then we have about a third who are not sure. But that's great to see that we have a majority of folks here have created LAUs. It's awesome. Yeah, not seeing 62% have. Cool, great.
And one more question.
Yeah. And our last question is, what is your biggest challenge with LAU administration? So this one you should be able to select multiple options if you would like. We have rent increase reviews as an option, staff capacity, monitoring, tenant communication, and other. This is something we looked at in our engagement throughout the process, so we'll talk about that later, but it's interesting to see here folks' response to this question. We also heard that staff capacity was a big issue. It's looking like that's a big challenge for a lot of you. Around 57% are saying staff capacity. Monitoring is also about 57%. And then rent increase reviews, 30%, tenant communication, 16%. Cool.
Great.
Okay. So staff capacity and monitoring tied there. Interesting. Awesome. Thank you guys for answering the questions.
Gwen, I'll turn it over to you to share some context and project overview.
I think you're doing the context, and then I'm doing the next section. You're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. My bad.
No worries.
Sharing screens. Great. So we wanted to just take a moment to define what LAUs are for our audience, although we do have Rieko from EOHLC presenting today, who will definitely go more into details of what LAUs actually are. But local action units, or LAUs, are really a tool for communities to create affordable units through some local enabling actions. The LAU program is housed within the Local Initiative Program, or LIP, administered by EOHLC. And these units are formed through local municipal actions, such as inclusionary zoning, which is by far the most common way of creating LAUs that we learned, followed by special permits that might require affordable units, sometimes rarely through the use of municipal land or funds or negotiated agreements. Typically, LAUs serve households earning up to 80% of the EMI, though we did see in some cases that affordability level went a little bit more deeper, say to 65% EMIs as well. LAUs can count towards communities' SHI or subsidized housing inventory, but they do need there is a whole process attached to it, and they need EOHLC approval to add that to the SHI. They don't automatically get added. And it is also, we found, important to clarify what LAUs are not. And so LAUs are different from the 40B projects that we generally see that require comprehensive permits. So LAUs do not require comprehensive permits, and they should, more importantly, not have any state financial subsidy attached to it. So LAUs are not financially subsidized by state, although state can provide technical assistance through the LAU program. This next slide, this is a map that shows how sort of local action units are distributed across the region and how many our communities have. As of September this year, there were approximately 4,600 LAUs across the Greater Boston region. About 70% are rental and rest are ownership. There was a very small share of LAUs that are age restricted, so they can be age restricted, though a lot of nuance goes into getting approved there. And they can be also supported through home funds. But again, a lot of policy and program related considerations go there. So your best bet would be to coordinate with EOHLC on figuring whether that can happen for your units. You can see there's a wide variation in the scale. Some communities have a few units while others have over 200. Communities like Watertown, Lexington, Cambridge, we see Marlborough and Framingham. There are some that have some of the highest counts in 200s and 300s. In many cases, that reflects longer standing inclusionary zoning or strong partnerships with local developers. And this range highlights some need around guidance and consistent administration practices that might make it easier for everyone. Every town is starting from a different place, but hopefully the tools and the resources we share in this toolkit or in this resource guide is helpful for all. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gwen to share some of the project overview.
Thanks, Sukanya. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. So this project came out of discussions that began in our inner core subregion and then sort of expanded out around rent increases in local action units and how those rent increases were outpacing the tenants' income growth. And this was really putting folks at risk for displacement. Especially coming out of the COVID pandemic, some communities were seeing rent hikes of 30% after that period of low rent increases. So this was a really big issue at that time. And there was a need identified for planners and municipalities to have more resources around procedures, onboarding materials, and best practices around LAU administration and creation. So you can go to the next slide. So our goals of this project were to assess local capacity and local action unit admin procedures within municipal governments. I'm sure many of you know as planners, that planners are the ones.
Okay.
I could just leave it in the background.
Yeah, leave it in the back.
Right, I'm just gonna mute. Okay. So municipalities and municipal planners often take on a lot of the work of administering local action units. So looking at that capacity, who's doing it and is there capacity to do that work as it needs to be done? We looked at rent increase trends, wanted to see, how high are those rent increases in a typical year? We heard about those big COVID increases, but what's sort of the general pattern? Understanding those trends and then sharing them out to raise awareness around how high the rent increases are typically within LAUs. And then a big goal was to create a resource guide at the end of this project to compile our resources, best practices, and lessons to be used by municipal planners throughout this process. So we engaged with a lot of different folks in this process. We were really grateful to have 14 partner municipalities, both within that inner core region and in other subregions of MAPC. They worked closely with us by doing focus groups, sharing their experience, as well as sharing their process, their municipal agreements that they use for LAUs. They were super helpful for us throughout this whole project. We engaged extensively with the state, especially with folks at UHLC. Rieko is on the call here today, worked with us a lot on this project, as well as Ali, who Sukanya mentioned couldn't be here, but she was super helpful in this. We worked with the SHI coordinator to understand the process for getting LAUs on the SHI. We also engaged with folks from the Regional Housing Services Office, including Liz Rust, who's on the call today. We met with housing consultants, and then we also met with some affordable housing developers in the region to hear about their experience with this process. So the project took a pretty a long schedule here. We started back in May of 2024, and I need to call out Alex Koppelman, who I believe is here today, who is actually sort of at the very beginning, the impetus for this project, helping it get off the ground in the ICC. So thanks to Alex for that, getting it started. And then Sukanya and I picked it up. So we started in the summer of 2024, and 2024, a lot of our time was spent doing that engagement, learning from our municipalities and our partners on what the process is like, what are the challenges that people are feeling in this process. And then 2025, we really focused on the creation of our resource guide. We worked with the state and with MHP to get feedback and to work collaboratively with them on this guide to make it as helpful and as accurate and in depth as we could. Okay, so I'm gonna welcome our speakers now, and we're gonna start with Rieko from HLC, who's gonna talk about their role in administering LAUs throughout the state.
Hey everyone, and sorry to be the last minute replacement for Ali. And I just, I really want to commend all the work that MAPC has done and, pulling together all these resources that I think will be invaluable, in helping communities throughout this process. Next slide. Okay. So, as was stated, the Local Initiative Program, which LAU falls under, is a state program that encourages locally driven efforts to create affordable housing. And it falls under the Chapter 40B legislation and was created in response to the opposition of the development of affordable housing in the 1960s. LIP provides a mechanism to encourage locally supported affordable housing where the municipality is engaged in the development of the project prior to the application to us, EOHLC. So there are two types of LIP projects. One, the 40B, and these are projects that would require a comprehensive permit, where a project superseding the local zoning, so they need to get a comprehensive permit, and the application has to be supported by the municipality. And what we're talking about today are the local action units, and these are what would require a municipal local action, and the municipality also submits the application. And I should say, that of the two types of projects, we have probably double the amount of local action unit projects versus 40B. So these are just pictures of various, 40B projects. I think one of the wonderful things about the program is that there's such a wide range of projects, everything from first-time home buyer buy-down programs to habitat projects to, 300 unit large developments. Okay, next slide. So the program is popular and it's growing. I've seen that since I started, 11 years ago. Since its inception in the 1980s, approximately 62,000 units of housing have been approved, almost 12,000 of which are affordable. And this year, 2,467 units were approved under LIP. Of those units, 1,612 were local action units. So the majority were local action units. And these are projects that were developed across the Commonwealth, as you know, the map showed. So why is LIP appealing to housing partners? Well, first of all, the units will count on the subsidized housing inventory. They are locally endorsed projects where the community has a say in the early stages. It's a non-competitive process, so you know we accept applications whenever they come in. It's not a competitive funding round issue like with our subsidized programs, our financially subsidized programs. And the comprehensive permit is a good vehicle for consolidating waivers. Next, okay. So for the local action unit process, I know this is going to be somewhat repetitive, but it's fairly simple. We need an endorsement by the municipality. So the chief executive officer of that municipality has to sign the application. There has to be evidence of some type of local action. There has to be an affirmative fair housing marketing plan and lottery, and then also a regulatory agreement. So some samples of local actions that are eligible: zoning-based approval, special permit, discretionary zoning approval, as of right approvals, which I'm sure a lot of you are approving right now. Conveyance of publicly owned land, utilization of community preservation or other local funds. As I said, it can't be any state funds, but any local funds could be a local action. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key components of the application is an affirmative fair housing marketing plan, because as a requirement, we have the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing and maximize these opportunities for, persons who would be least likely to apply. Continue. Some of the components of a marketing plan would be a description of the marketing and outreach. Where are you going to do that? Sample advertisements, application materials, information materials, eligibility requirements. It has to be a lottery, and has to be the lottery in the resident selection process. And if there's going to be a local preference, we need a description of that. And we luckily have an expert that will go after me to go through that in further detail. So the subsidized housing inventory, which I mentioned earlier, is a list of the number of subsidized units in each community and the percentage of those units. So generally speaking, if in order to be eligible to have units count, first you have to have an eligible state or federal subsidy program, and the local action unit program under LIP would count as a state subsidy program. It's a little bit confusing for some people because this is the only program that's not offering any type of financial subsidy. But the legislature had deemed LIP an eligible program because of the technical assistance or the review that is provided. The units have to be affordable households at or below 80% of AMI, and as was said, could be below that. There has to be a long use restriction, and that would be the regulatory agreement, which is one of the components of the application. And they're also subject to the affirmative fair housing marketing and resident selection plan. So what is counted on the SHI? If it's a rental project, if at least 25% of the units are at 80% or below, or at least 20% of the overall units are at 50% below, then all the units would count. If there are fewer proposed units, only the affordable units would count. For ownership, it's only the affordable units that would count on the SHI. So here's our contact information, and you're welcome to email or phone Ally or me, regarding any questions regarding local action units. If you have a 40B application, you're welcome to contact me. We also put the number and contact of our counsel, Margot Leclerc, and she's the one that oversees the subsidized housing inventory. And here are just some links to the local initiative program, which encompasses, the local LAU information, to our website with all the forms, and then also link to the subsidized housing inventory. And that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Reiko. That was super helpful. And yeah, we definitely throughout the resource guide highlight that your best first step could be reaching out to EOHLC to sort of coordinate on any sense of what the project you're seeing might be, and then going from there with further recommendations. But I'm going to now, and we are doing great with time. We are actually ahead of time, so we don't have to be too worried about being too tight. But yeah, I'm going to now introduce Liz Rust, who is the director of the Regional Housing Services Office, which serves a few communities in the northwest side of the region. I'll let her take over from here.
Thank you, Sukiyama. So I'm Liz Rust. I'm the director of the Regional Housing Services Office, and I'm here to talk about the collaborating with the LIP Local Action Program. So the RHSO, just a brief introduction, it's these 10 communities that have joined together, and the RHSO is the servicing of the 10 communities. We do all forms of affordable housing administration, including helping with LIP LAU applications, as well as monitoring and other kinds of things for these organizations. And I only bring this up because we saw that many people struggled with the staff administration of the program. So this is one solution that has worked well for these communities, is to have staff assistance in your organization, sort of, or we're a third party, but we're sort of working for the staff to help in these functions. So I'll also talk about SHI eligibility, because many times that's why people are here with the LIP LAU application. Oftentimes we see in permits, the units will be on the SHI, and that means so much, and means so much about how to go forward from a regulatory framework. And as Rieko mentioned, there are 5 elements to count on the SHI, and here they are again. A lot of times we hear, well, there's, the income level of the person who's already living in the unit is under the income limit, so that should count on the SHI. But that's, against number 4, it's not subject to an affirmative fair housing marketing plan and bringing people in. So all of these 5 pieces are very important. The other thing that is sometimes overlooked about how useful the LIP LAU program is it comes with the technical assistance, I think Rieko called it. And what that looks like is the regulatory agreement that you have. So the legal documents and the legal expertise of HLC and all of their many years of experience in affordable housing and in these kinds of projects is a tremendous resource. Without the LIP LAU program, you as a municipality are having to come up with your own regulatory agreement and your own affordable housing restriction, and modeling that and trying to figure that out, leads to some, no standardization and some of the benefits. So there's a lot of benefits for the LIP LAU in that perspective. And here's just some notes about when to get on the SHI, the timing, because that's always a concern, and it's different for the 40B permits. The 40B permits can get on the SHI very early, not the same with the LIP LAU. So there's 5 main areas for municipal actions. And again, that's what we're talking about here. That's the focus of my presentation, is about the municipal role with the LIP LAU. The LIP LAU program has many people involved, including the developers and the subsidizing agency and HLC. But I'm really focusing here on the municipal actions. And there are 5 areas. that are key for any municipality to be involved with the LIP program. One is issuing the zoning permit, and this is where all the requirements get established. So it's really important that all the affordable units get identified there with the various aspects of them. The second part is to approve the LIP application, and then to execute the regulatory agreement, support the marketing and occupancy, and then to monitor annually. We'll talk a little bit more about each of those. Right, so issuing the zoning permit. Some key pieces here, the number and the specific locations of the affordable units. You know, how many bedrooms are they? What's the bath? What's the affordability level? I always think it's nice to look at the floor plans of the closets and the storage and make sure that those are adequate. Imagine if you are living in that unit, you know, how is it looking for you? Sometimes I think our role is to be the affordable resident at the table before they're here, just to give their voice to the process. Parking is always important. Where is everyone parking? How is parking assigned? And then the timing, preferences. And for larger projects, we have also worked with municipalities to implement a monitoring agreement with the developer, because the monitoring responsibility is a real responsibility and takes some real effort from the municipality. So setting up a side agreement for the municipality to account for that cost. And then this is, I think many people are familiar with this. If you've done a LIP application, you're asked to approve it. So you say, well, what am I looking at? So you would compare it to your permit and all the other submitted materials to make sure it's consistent. You'd look at the plans and the site plans and the floor plans, and again, the parking. The parking often changes between the permit, where it's just, you know, like here's that big parking lot, and now who actually gets the parking? How many spaces are there? Are they, you know? And then the legal components. A draft regulatory agreement is provided, lease or deed rider, condo documents, and various other pieces. So I always think when you're presented a LIP package, that you would look for these three separate pieces of it. One, the application and the affirmative fair housing marketing plan. I like to see all these things in actually three separate PDFs, because it's a little bit easier for the review. I mean, no one wants to really be presented with a 300-page PDF and asked to sign off on that with all of these documents kind of put in there, and it's hard to sort through them. But the first piece, and then the second piece being the plans, like what are you comparing this to? What are the units and some of that detail? And then again, the legal components as a separate piece. In this process, you'll be confirming and approving any preferences that are being used. And again, preferences are different than eligibility requirements. So preferences are accessible features, household size, local preference, which is often what municipalities would request. Looking at most, it's 70%. You would have to do the justification. It's always at initial occupancy only with minority balancing. The lottery agent knows how to do all of that, but they're looking to you to define and confirm your local preference, if any, and at what percentage. And we just note here that age restriction isn't a preference. It's either the project is age restricted or it's not. Once the LIP application gets approved and you have sent it on its way to the state, or actually sent it back to the developer and have them sent it on to the state, then after some period of time, it will come back for approval. So I guess that's the first part there, the approval, right? So the approval of the LIP application asks for a housing partnership and trust, or a trust to sign on, the mayor select board, the chief executive officer, and then HLC. So that's where that gets approved. The regulatory agreement then comes back as a sign of final approval of the whole package. And there's always some complexity. I don't even know, complexity is like a big word. There's always some logistics involved in actually executing the regulatory agreement and getting that recorded. There's three originals, the developer, then the municipality, and HLC. So those are all parties. And the key piece there is that the municipality is a party to the regulatory agreement. The municipality is a monitoring agent in partnership with HLC. So that's the piece here. So sometimes the LIP LAU sounds like a great idea in the beginning, like we wrote our zoning, we have inclusionary zoning, and like now we're done. Like we have all these affordable units, it's great. But the LIP program signs you on as a municipality through the monitoring, and they do that through the regulatory agreement. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about that in monitoring. So the next piece that happens, once the regulatory agreement has been approved and recorded, then the municipality can support the marketing and outreach. And I think this is a great opportunity to make sure that your residents and people in the community know about the lottery. Get it out on your website, employees, boards, committees, and when people call you, who's keeping that name? Like, oh, I hear this great project is coming up, and, how do I get my name on the list? Do you have someplace in your municipality where you're taking those names? People would like that. Some municipalities have many, I don't know, a half dozen maybe different lottery agents working in there. So there's not one lottery agent who's going to be able to take those names and say, oh, here's my project now, and then I have this other project coming up. Over time, some lottery agents specialize in a municipality, will be the go-to lottery agent, which works out really well for the residents and the applicants, but that's not always the case. So go to the information session, go to the lottery, see how this all works and see who shows up and how it's all run. I suggest also asking all your lottery agents to give you this information so that you can start to consolidate and see what kind of need is happening in your municipality. And doing that by aggregating the lottery information. How many people are applying? What bedroom sizes are they looking for? How many people in the household? Those sorts of pieces. So in annual monitoring, so this is a key piece. I think this came up very high in the attendees here in terms of what people were having some questions about or looking for help with. So in the regulatory agreement, is this quote here, I don't know, phrase, excerpt, I guess, which is really what really puts it in about the municipality responsibility. So the chief executive officer shall annually certify in writing to HLC that the low and moderate income units continue, and then it goes on and on. So it's an annual certification to HLC for each of these LIP projects. So now HLC is not going to be knocking on your door and saying, well, where's your certification? Where's your certification? But clearly, by putting this in there, the onus is on the municipality to take some ownership and make sure that the projects and the units are being managed as they were intended. So what does this actually mean? So for rental, it means rent approvals, reviewing property annual reports, doing a review of their marketing. Are they still listed on, Housing Navigator or My Mass Homes when they have vacancies? And on the ownership side, annual certifications, refinancing capital improvements, resales, annual reporting. And again, you're partners with HLC in this monitoring, so it's not only for you as the municipality, but it's definitely your responsibility. And then annual reporting to HLC, and then of course general resident inquiries. You all know that whether you intended to or not, you offer housing as a municipal service. And you might not be staffed that way. You might not have a sign in the bottom of your town hall like housing services of this way, but you are part of that in more of the LIP LAU projects that you permit and make available in your community. The more housing you are providing, and people are going to call you. That's what they do. They call, right? I don't have to tell you all that, right? So, okay, next slide. So in the rental monitoring, so there's the monthly rent requirement. So just making sure that, people are charging the appropriate rent, that they're not charging too much. We have had situations where when we go and do the monitoring that they actually are charging too much. They just didn't do the math right. I mean, you know how hard these income limits are to do the math and what is the right rent based on this limit and that. And so had some rent returns, rent refunds. tenants are still eligible, making sure that the property managers are recertifying the tenants annually. The physical units, taking a quick look at those. The number and mix of units, you permitted 3 bedrooms, three bedrooms, or 10 2 bedrooms, whatever the unit mix was. Is that still what's available being rented on the affordable program when you get the reports? And then that they're still marketing affirmatively through those channels. Those are the things to look for on the rental monitoring. Talk a little bit about rent increases. So there's a lot of words here on the slide, and there's that little chart over there. I think that you're going to be a little bit more of that coming up. But so we expect requests annually after the income limits are updated, usually in, March, April, May. And then have your annual report from the property owner and last year's rent increase available, so that you know what to implement, what to approve. The regulatory agreement, I think that would, there's been a lot of discussion on this, allows for rent to be determined based on the income limit. And here's some information about the history of that. And then starting in COVID, HLC implemented implement's probably not the right word, but approved a method where the renewals were approved at a top 5% increase versus new tenants or vacancies that could come in at a higher rent increase. So that introduced some differences and managed the rent increases for existing tenants. When we talk about these things, these are maximum rents as well. So property managers have flexibility to implement less than this, and certain tenants aren't able to pay. I think the property managers really want to keep their tenants, right? They don't want to have a lot of vacancies. They want to help people pay their rent, but they also need to support their property. So it's a balance. Anyway, they have a 30-day time frame to approve the rent increases. So I'm just going to leave it at that. There's a lot of resources that are in the LIP LAU resource guide that we're going to see coming up. And I know my next speaker is going to talk more about this. Ownership monitoring, send and track annual self-certifications, review the registry of deeds for any title impacting activity, and review and approve resales and refinances and capital improvements. So that's the scope of the ownership monitoring. So I went long, I'm sorry, but a lot of information, and glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. This was very helpful. It's always good to have the nuts and bolts and see like how the actual implementation happens, and speaks to a lot of how much a municipality needs to do and work on when it comes to implementation. And sometimes they have support from RHSOs, not always. I also want to use this opportunity to plug a training that Liz will be conducting, I think with NHP, an online training on LAUs in January of 15. So I just wanted to sort of flag that to attendees. I'm sure there'll be more information incoming on MHP's website. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurie, the Director and City Planner at City of Melrose. We're grateful for her participation throughout this project. She was Melrose was part of our advisory group as well. And she'll be speaking a little bit about the challenges at the municipal level when it comes to monitoring LAUs. So over to you, Laurie.
Okay, thank you, Sukanya. Yes, so MAPC asked me to highlight some of the challenges with monitoring LAUs that Melrose has had and that were shared by other communities as MAPC took on this project, which was really helpful to discuss the issues, share ideas and resources, and to make recommendations to help with these challenges. So if you're not familiar with Melrose, just to give a little context, it's a small city north of Boston, population of 29,000. We have 12,000 housing units and 105 units of that fall in the local action units. The participating communities in this project were varying sizes, but many were kind of around the size of Melrose. So Melrose LAUs are primarily obtained through inclusionary zoning. So projects that have 5 to 7 residential units can provide a unit, or they can make a monetary contribution to our Affordable Housing Trust. But residential projects with 8 or more units need to provide 15% of the units as affordable at 80% of the area median income. We've had this regulation in place since 2004, and we amended the percentage required and some of the other regulations on the inclusionary zoning in 2019. But it's been an effective way to gain affordable units in the city. So as Rieko and Liz discussed, there's specific regulations around permitting these units, and going through the LAU application process and the regulatory agreement. But my focus is going to be on after occupancy of these units. The municipality has that continued role in monitoring the units. So the agent submits that annual report that shows that the units are still in compliance with the regulatory agreement, and has detailed information about the tenants that are in each of those specific units. So we get, the number of people in the household and income certification, and, when they first occupied the unit, and a lot of very detailed information for each specific unit. And also there can be a request for rent increases. So the focus on MAPC's project was on the rental side of things, and kind of permitting and monitoring rental units. Home ownership is easier to monitor, and so this was really focused on the rental aspect. So for challenges, I'll start with administrative processes. There's no formal system for submitting annual reports or the request for rent increases in terms of like the format that needs to come in, what forms a municipality will use, and specifically what information each municipality would like in order to kind of check that these projects are continuing to be in compliance with regulatory agreements. And there isn't a specific timeline for when each property can submit the annual report and the request for rent increases, but there is a 30-day window where the municipality has to respond to those requests. And they can be pretty detailed and require looking back at past annual reports to kind of compare the tenants in each of the units and see what has changed. And they're also sometimes not submitted every year, so there can be some questions that come up and back and forth between the agent that's submitting these things and then municipal staff to get all of the information. There's also, just getting up to speed as a new staff person and needing to kind of understand what our responsibility is and get into the details to do a good job in making sure that we're appropriately monitoring the units. And so sometimes fitting these requests into an existing workload can be a challenge when they're kind of submitted especially when they're submitted kind of at various times throughout the year. And then from the housing consultant side, they're kind of working with different municipalities and needing to adjust the information that they need to submit based on whatever the municipality is requesting. So the most difficult issue that a lot of us had was kind of dealing with rent increase requests when they're large. So some of the speakers have mentioned during COVID, there was that limit of the rent increases. And then, so therefore after COVID, I know in Melrose, we got a request for a 25% increase in rent. Other communities had up to 30% increase in rent. So we just worry about displacement, and we have the data from those tenants of those units, and their incomes either are not changing or minimally increasing. And there are many tenants that don't have any other financial support. So they may be displaced. So just to give you some data about this. So the rents in Melrose are allowed to be up to 80% of the area median income. Other communities set a lower percentage, so there'd be, you know, kind of more affordable. So this top table is showing the area median income and in corresponding maximum gross rent over the last 7 years. So there's been between a 2 and 11% increase in the AMI over those years. So that can be quite a jump for people whose incomes aren't increasing. And then the table at the bottom has the eligible incomes by household size and corresponding number of bedrooms per unit. And the last column there is the range of rents for local action units in Melrose. So it can vary greatly from project to project. So for example, for the 1-bedroom units, there's a range in rent from $1,600 per month to $24,000. $2,400 per month. So in Melrose, we've had some success with requesting smaller rent increases when they seem excessive, as have other communities. But there isn't kind of clear criteria for how to do this. As is in the name, these are local units, and you know, the municipality has to buy into kind of monitoring and being actively involved with these units. So we really appreciate the discussion around, is there a better way of dealing with these rent escalations? It's tough getting calls from residents of these units where they know we have some kind of, they know we have involvement and some ability to negotiate. So that's kind of a hard part of this administration. And the last challenge I'll highlight is on municipal capacity. A lot of planning departments don't have a lot of staff. And with that staff, there's, you know, various aspects of planning, and your planner or other staff might not be experts in housing. So that can be a challenge to kind of get up to speed on monitoring the units. And ideally, communities set up a process for monitoring before annual reports and rent requests are submitted for local action units that are created. But you might not know or that you should do this or kind of know how to do it. And as the number of LAUs grows in your community, it's really exciting, and this is a really great program, but it also requires then more time to monitor, because you are looking kind of at a very detailed review of each unit and the tenant income. So we really appreciate MAPC's work in pulling together this guidebook and making recommendations that will be helpful to address these challenges.
Great. Thank you so much, Laurie. We appreciate you sharing how it sort of works and some of the key challenges that Melrose has been facing. And I know that this has been common and echoed throughout our findings. I will at this point turn it over to Gwen to give us a little bit of a demo of our webpage. Before she shares her screen, I can let her speak a little bit, and then I can stop sharing, Gwen, and you can share your screen.
Great. Thanks, Sukanya. Yeah, so I'm going to take us through this actual resource guide that we've created. That's really what we hope to share with you all today. The resource guide is a web-based tool. It's housed on the MAPC website. We'll drop the link in the chat, but also if you just Google MAPC LAUs, it'll come up for you. The website contains, oh, I think we need to go back to the slide, sorry. The website has just a project overview, sort of what we covered at the beginning of our presentation, what happened during this project, how we got to where we are today. Then we have a table of contents that talks about our 4 key sections, which are LAU basics was sort of like 101, what is an LAU, how it works, the application process, and then municipal resources and challenges and recommendations. And then we have additional materials. At the end, we have a glossary of terms, and we have these downloadable one-pagers throughout, which I'll talk about. So I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm gonna show you the website here. Can you see that? It's loading.
It's
Yeah.
loading.
It's loading. Yeah.
Is it there now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so this is our website. Local action units, a resource guide, so you know you're in the right place. And then we have these are 4 sections here, so you can jump to those, but I'm gonna sort of just scroll through the page. We have our program overview here, and our one-pagers are throughout, but they're also collected here on this side. The website itself is sort of a summary of these one-pagers. The one-pagers go into a little bit more detail into what we're talking about. So if you want more detail to dive into understanding something, the one-pagers are really helpful. If you click on them, they'll open a PDF. And you can read them or download them. We have our contact information here, so that's another place if you want to reach out to Sukanya or I to get more information or chat with us. You can find our emails here. So once you get to our LAU 101, it's a lot of what we covered at the beginning. Basics of LAUs, we have the map of the LAUs. We talk about what is not a local action unit, because that can be confusing. And then here, if you click, let's see if it'll, can you see that PDF? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, it'll open PDF in a separate tab for you, and then you can look at our more detailed information with some definitions and some graphics to help understand LAUs as a whole. And then if we keep going to our application process, we have that laid out step by step. Each step has a drop down that talks about it a little bit more. But again, this is sort of a summary. If you want more information, the one pager is here. It goes into more detail over a couple of pages talking about that LAU application process. And then we have step-by-step municipal duties. This sort of goes together with the application process. What should you be doing as a municipality throughout this process? Things like submitting the application itself, but also putting the units on the SHI and then monitoring sort of the whole life of the LAU. And here we have created a Excel sheet. I'm not going to open it because it'll probably be hard to show, but it's something you can download and use for yourself. It was designed so that you can download it and adapt it to use it for your municipality. It has the sort of duties that you have to do during each phase of the process. And then it has tracking mechanisms for you in there to say, yep, we did this or need to do this, as well as some notes on what to do at each step. Then we have a long list of resources that are hopefully helpful to municipalities as you go through this process. This first section here is really about the applications and the state guidance on LAUs. And then templates. This is a section that we think is super helpful, especially when it comes to municipal capacity. If you're just starting out in this process, this is a great place to go to get some templates to get you started in the tools you'll need to move through the LAU process. So we have email templates for monitoring. We have approval and notification letters for the rent increase process, regulatory agreements. These are super important. So we have a few different examples from different municipalities we worked with. Rental increase memos, annual compliance reports. It's all super helpful stuff. And then we have a section on fair housing lottery resources. So this would be the step where you're doing the housing lottery to determine who is living in the LAUs. There's a lot of different information here on that. some affordable housing management softwares. This is something we heard from some folks that we met with in engagement can be really helpful in monitoring LAUs and can really help municipal capacity if you have a really good software set up that helps you out. So there's some examples here if you're interested in that. And then we have a few resources for tenants here as well that you can share if you have a tenant who wants help finding housing in an LAU. Maybe they're struggling with displacement. The Housing Navigator is a place to help people find housing. So there's a few resources there to help folks who are looking for housing in this landscape. And then we have challenges and recommendations here as our last section. We talk about the challenges that we discovered throughout this engagement process. So Kanya is going to talk about our challenges and recommendations next, but this section here really goes into more detail. So if you want even more detail on our recommendations in particular, this is a great place to come and read more about them. So again, we have our one-pagers here, and then recommendations for each one. We have a drop-down where we talk about it in a lot more detail, and we have a one-pager where we have all of our recommendations. Some of these are things that you can implement, and some of them are sort of longer term things that would require big changes in the regulatory landscape. So it's sort of some different things here, but definitely a good place to come when you're trying to set up a good process for LAUs in your municipality. And then, as I mentioned here at the end, we have our glossary. We just think it's helpful that we define all these terms. There's so many terms and acronyms in planning. We want to make sure that they're all here so we're not confusing anyone who's new to this, or, you know, just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So if there are any terms we're using today that you don't know, hopefully they should be here. You can come see what we're talking about. So yeah, lots of stuff here. There's lots of things to click, lots of information to find all throughout the website. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now. And I'm gonna pass it back to Sakanya.
Great. Thank you so much, Gwen. I'm going to reshare my screen and would appreciate a thumbs up when it pops up. Great. Awesome. So I appreciate all the patience today. We as we go through this webinar, we are almost at the end. I'm going to share a few recommendations, some highlights based on some of the challenges we heard and the engagement we did. So just wanted to sort of note that these recommendations build upon insights gathered from municipal staff, state agencies, and housing professionals who are engaged in this effort of administering and monitoring LAUs. And as LAU programs see more increased utilization, there is a greater need for stronger support from municipal staff, and we acknowledge that, and hopefully these recommendations speak to that. While some reforms require state-level action, many can be led by or piloted by municipalities and regional partners. And so beginning with the first recommendation, that is around establishing transparent enforceable rent increase standards. One of the most persistent challenges municipalities sort of faced during our engagement that we heard about was their limited ability to influence or regulate rent increases, or sort of lack of leverage. In focus groups, staff reported feeling that their role is largely reactive, and while when they receive rent increase requests up to 30% in a single year, often following multi-year gaps, there is no sort of way to make adjustments to maybe make it gradual. Without annual caps or structured review windows, this catch-up approach results in sudden rent hikes that threaten affordability and tenant stability, as most speakers sort of talked about. This challenge is compounded by regulatory agreements that defer to maximum rent based on sort of the HUD's 80% AMI levels, or whatever affordability level the municipality is at, even when the local household incomes might not be close to that and might be lower or much lower from those AMI levels. Lack of clear criteria or legal tools for municipalities to push back on rent increases deemed excessive or misaligned with local conditions is, again, as I mentioned, an issue. And so we talk about thinking about rent increase caps, which can be tied to local indicators such as consumer price index or local wage growth or cost of living adjustments and others. We saw an example of it as EHLC had that 5% rent increase cap during the pandemic era. Ideally, this would be a statewide standard that would include a model regulatory agreement with provisions of standardized rent increase caps, fully acknowledging that that's a difficult thing to do and would need a lot of legal review. But we wanted to sort of highlight that as a possible recommendation and solution. Another recommendation we have is about considering managing vacant and occupied units separately to balance affordability and flexibility. So allowing maximum allowable rents in vacant units, but gradually increasing those in occupied units, while ensuring that these don't lead to soft eviction. So a lot of thought needs to go in there and sort of research, but we thought that this could be a viable strategy. Another recommendation we have is around streamlining monitoring and rent approval processes at municipal levels. As Laurie also mentioned, and we learned throughout the engagement process, many municipalities lack formalized systems of administering LAUs, which results in ad hoc and fragmented workflows. Rent increase requests, as mentioned, were frequently submitted and negotiated via email or with no standardized forms. Or submission schedules or routing protocols internally. And as staff turnover happens or multiple roles of various entities get mixed into it, documenting things can be a problem. The roles of various entities such as housing trusts and planning boards can be unclear, leading to confusion and inefficiencies. Without formal internal processes that can even more get complicated. And so our recommendation is around formalizing that. We have some examples of how that can be done in detail in the webpage. Also recommend centralized data management so that if staff turnover happens, the email is not lost. And then, of course, sort of moving away from manual tracking of things and having a centralized database. I think there are some municipalities and some examples there where municipalities are using smart forms and others, which is a good start to centralizing that information. The fourth recommendation is around expanding municipal capacity, as we heard from our audience today and our speakers, that's a major challenge to effective LAU administration, having a lack of dedicated staff with affordable housing expertise at the local level, or just generally staff who cannot do all the things because they don't have 800 hours in the day. So this makes it especially difficult to proactively oversee affordability requirements, monitoring responsibilities, and tenant support. We feel that the shared housing services offices or creating SHSOs can offer a particularly effective model for expanding local capacity as municipalities can pool resources at the region level. We also share in our webpage another example from CMRPC, our sister regional planning agency, that have a regional housing coordinator that assists municipalities, but that's just another example of how it's being done. But yeah, that's a key. We thought that SHSOs can be a good outcome of sort of getting added capacity at the regional level and for municipalities to have a little bit more help. There are a few other additional recommendations that we did not highlight here, but things like improving state and municipal data sharing and exploring pilots, implementing feasibility of either including internet as in the utility allowances, because it is not right now. And we recognize it's a bigger systemic change that will sort of warrant that, as well as considering unbundling sort of the parking costs from the regulatory agreement to further reduce that baseline rent that needs to be paid. Yeah, these were some highlights we wanted to share. So now we are in the Q&A portion of our webinar, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop the screen share so that we can all look at each other. And I'm going to lean on Gwen on highlighting a couple of questions that we can post towards our speakers, or if we can respond and shout out to folks, to speakers who are already in the chat, responding to as many as they can get to here.
Yeah, thanks. We have a few questions in the chat that I want to pose to our speakers. The first question that came through is for Rieko, I think specifically, but maybe Liz, you might have some insight as well, is when is the affirmative fair housing plan submitted and to whom, and then when is it approved?
That is part of the application. It's a required piece of the application, so it is submitted with the application. And, once we receive it, we start to review it. But it has to be approved before we give final approval.
Great, thank you. And then next question we have in the chat, do any municipalities currently conduct the lottery on behalf of the developer? They said the cost of a lottery agent is frequently identified as a financial obstacle during the application process.
I'll answer that. I'll try. So sometimes people, developers apply for permits and they don't really understand the affordable component and don't understand what it's going to take to do that, and haven't built it into their financial pro forma. Municipalities can develop this expertise. It does involve like a fixed cost of advertising. So there's some hard, cash you're putting out, and there's some training and expertise that you need to develop. You need to take the lottery class from the state, as well as the HUD certified occupancy specialist, and to be able to project and to determine income eligibility for some, for like the Lyft driver or something where it's really uneven income, takes some learning and some technical expertise, and it definitely takes time to administer a lottery. But if the municipality would like to develop that expertise and offer it to developers at no cost, I mean, yeah, sure. But it's going to cost in terms of time. So when we hear that it just takes time just to administer the LIP program, actually administering the lotteries under the LIP program and still do all that monitoring and the rent approvals and all of that is just more staff resource. But of course, anyone can become a certified lottery agent. There's technical training, and then there's mentoring or partnering with someone who's done it before, so that you don't make any mistakes. If you make mistakes, people get a little upset, and they might file discrimination claims against you and all sorts of things that you really want to avoid. Yeah.
Yeah, and some communities have, sometimes they have thousands of applications to process for a lottery. So, it may not even be one person that has to be involved.
We just did a
Right?
lottery in Weston. We got 85 applications for one unit. So it just took a lot of time. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's helpful. Next question we have, I think could go to any of you, but Lori, I'd be curious to hear if you have a thought on how you've handled this, if you've seen something similar in Melrose, and also Sukanya, if we have any sort of recommendations around this. The question is, any thoughts on how to deal with landlords seeking 3 times monthly income for an 80% unit, which might equate to a very narrow band of 77% to 80% AMI?
This issue hasn't come up in Melrose, so unfortunately, I don't have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I can add, based on our engagement, I mean, if it's below 80% AMI, they are legally allowed to go up to that. So there's not necessarily a lot of leverage that municipalities can have, though municipalities have had success in negotiating it down or asking the developer to not go that high, and sort of but it's not at all something that is formalized in the regulatory agreement. So technically it's legal and they can fully go up to that level, though some municipalities have had success in negotiating it down, but it's very case to case based. Wondering if any other folks on the call who might have had such, any municipal staff who might have had such instances want to share it.
I mean, Liz has worked with communities who've had a lot of success in negotiating lower rents. I mean, if it's, you know, like you were saying, 30%, I think most reasonable people would agree that that's high. I mean, if it's, I think it never hurts to ask, particularly if they have had a good experience with their tenants. I mean, Liz, I mean, I think you with your Metro West communities, I think you've had a lot of success with that.
Yeah, so we have been able to work with municipalities to approve only up to 5% of the approved rents, for existing tenants, or the calculated rents, which is whatever's lower. I'm looking at this question, though. This was like landlords seeking 3 times monthly income. Sometimes that relates to a minimum income. Landlords often look for a minimum income to make sure that people can afford the rent. And the standards, the LIP standards, don't get into a minimum income. That's really a leasing standard. It's usually between 30 and 40% of your income would be your minimum income. So, but I'm not sure exactly what the question is asking. So.
Okay. Thank you all. Next question, Laura, you answered this in the chat, but I wondered, I'm curious, you said, so Melrose has 105 LAU units. It's within 10 different developments. Are they all a similar size, or is it sort of a range of property sizes there?
It is a range. So the way that our inclusionary zoning is set up, it can be, 1 unit or, 30 units. But it's pretty much the same process, for the range of, size for a project. So it is kind of dealing with a lot of different agents if you have kind of the units spread over many different properties. But in terms of, needing that annual report and getting the information about the tenants is the same process regardless of size.
Great, thank you. Next question, I think, Rieko, this might be more for you. Can affordable units created through local actions end up on the SHI without going through LIP?
No. I mean, we'll see, they need to have that state subsidy program to qualify for the subsidized housing inventory. And so if there's no state financial subsidy that they're receiving, which would most likely not be the case, then LIP would be the vehicle.
Great, thank you. And then another question about LIP. Does LIP determine the rents and income limits? How does this work if the inclusionary ordinance or local funding sources have their own income limits and rent calculation methods?
Well, I mean, it cannot exceed 30% of 80%, but it certainly could be lower. If there is some local requirement, they would be at 80. I mean, I think that, be up to the municipality, but it just cannot exceed 30% of 80%.
And I would add too that, and anyone of the presenters can correct me if I'm wrong, but the rents and income limits are determined based on the AMI, which is determined by HUD. So that in some ways, that HUD number plays a large role in this as well.
Right. So HUD publishes the income limits, And then the regulatory agreement will specify the method and the formula for using that income limit to determine the rent.
And
Yeah, I
so,
oh, sorry, go for it, Lily.
I just wanted to maybe help clarify what this person is asking. So the inclusionary zoning is for projects that are using our zoning ordinance. They're not asking for any relief through the LIP 40B process to build something that's not allowed per zoning. So it's just like a regular kind of standard development that is using the zoning ordinance. They may, need to request for special permit or variance or something like that, but these are projects that are complying with zoning and just kind of going through the normal permitting process, and then afterwards, have to submit the local action unit application and go through the regulatory agreement for those specific units that are required to be affordable.
And Lori, I would assume that when you're determining like the allowable rents for your local action units, you're also using the HUD AMI number. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so it's set in the zoning ordinance as 80% of area median income, and then you take the 30% of that and for the maximum rent and the individual tenants income doesn't matter. It's kind of set in the regulations. So communities can have a lower percentage or have a range of our percentages, so it's really a local regulation.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just to clarify on this specific question, when you're asking about if there's basically a discrepancy between the inclusionary ordinance and the LIP program, there shouldn't be, because both of them are based on that HUD AMI number, which is a national set of numbers published for areas. Okay, our next question. Are there deadlines or timelines that are based on the data that an LAU application is submitted to HLC?
No, we're on a rolling basis.
Great. And then for a question on local preference, what are HLC's requirements for what should be included in a local preference support letter?
We want to see, how much of a local preference, and it cannot exceed 70% of the units. There has to be some demonstration of need, some data showing what percentage of the people are cost burden, for example, or how many people, are on the housing authority wait list, things like that. And also some explanation of how they're going to mitigate the discriminatory effects of having a local preference. And, we have samples that we can show people, and there's also information in the 40B guidelines.
Awesome. There's a question which maybe folks could answer in the chat as well, is if folks have successfully added increase caps in regulatory agreements. And that would specifically be rental increase caps.
Yeah.
Liz, is that something you've done?
Are you talking about after the regulatory agreement was approved?
So if I could just weigh in a little bit there, I think the question comes from the Gloucester folks. So first off, I just want to say it's interesting to be at MAPC and hear about this from municipalities encountering these big rent increase requests, and then work for a city and then see it happen and see how much it impacts people in these units, and feeling like we want to have more tools to be able to prevent that from happening. So one of the things that seemed to stick out was the regulatory agreement is what actually says how much the rent can increase after you've created an affordable unit. So you've gone through all this work to finally bring affordable units online, but then you find out later that it's not as stable as you think. And here in Gloucester, we had like very low income, extremely low income households being faced with $500, $700 increases in rent. So it seemed like, there's not a whole lot we can do with this inclusionary zone development I'm referencing that's already been permitted and everything. But when we're doing it again in the future, it seems like we could have a very strict regulatory agreement to cap how much they're allowed to increase rent later on. But I don't really have a frame of reference of, what would be an absurd cap where the developer would walk away and say, I'm not working here, which is something we're very mindful of when we're creating inclusionary zoning or anything else. But I think also completely unaware of the regulatory agreement's role in that. For inclusionary zoning, we might have a pro forma analysis that says you can only require this much without a developer walking away. But the regulatory agreement seems to have a financial impact too. So I think, I can't wait to dig through the resources that you have on the website and hear from other folks, but that just seemed to be a key area that we were blind about, without, learning about this whole administrative side of affordable housing.
I think that, I think in your particular case, it's a little bit different, because the market was so close to the affordable rents. So I think knowing, what your affordable rents are, it seems like it would be reasonable, in your next project to have a lower AMI that's lower. If market is at 80, then, you could propose a lower AMI in the regulatory agreement or a cap. I mean, I think Liz has worked on a regulatory agreement in a town, a main town, which had a cap in the increase. So,
Right.
We can talk about it after, but there are definitely samples about, what other towns have done to have a lower AMI or a cap on the increase.
Yeah, I mean, the key is to get that language in before the red line regulatory agreement goes to HLC in the beginning of the project. And that, of course, that the developer agrees to that. And then once it's in that draft regulatory agreement, either by a cap or by the AMI or different mechanisms, then you can use that going forward. But many projects don't have that in the regulatory agreement, nor will a developer agree to that cap on an ongoing perpetual basis, right? That's the whole deal with the regulatory agreements. They're in perpetuity, so that they'll agree like on a year by year, but not, on a go forward.
Yeah, and just to provide some context, there's an inclusionary zoning development I was mentioning where now the market rate rents are maybe going to be more affordable than the affordable units that are at 80% AMI.
Well,
So,
I think there's another, I think that there's a standard that says that the affordable rents will always be $500 or something below the market.
okay,
So there's a different standard to sort of manage that, because that's illogical, right? Like, as we go forward, right?
But I don't think that's something that's not something that's in the guidelines. I
Yeah.
mean, I think it seems common sense that it would be, but it's not something that's written in the guidelines that there's a certain number.
When that happened with one project, we
Yeah.
that came up and in the LIP agreement, yeah. So
just
want
to throw one more thing out there to make another point about these regulatory agreements is we've had some affordable homes come online, affordable home ownership, but they're in an HOA. And so then after it's all approved and said and done, the folks over there then want to increase the HOA fee. And the only thing that protects that is the regulatory agreement again. So I think, for Gloucester, we really are interested in building capacity around the administrative side of affordable housing so we can prevent these issues and mitigate, and control and be confident that the affordable homes we're creating are really going to remain affordable.
Thanks, Alex, for sharing that. Yeah. With 1 minute remaining, I wanted to jump in. I really appreciated the thoughtful discussion today. And I keep hearing new challenges like the HOA discussion that Alex mentioned. That's not something that I was aware of as a challenge. So this program continues to sort of surprise me in terms of the nuance that can come in and how we can think about tenant protections. At the end of the day, we want folks who are in affordable units to stay there and those units to be preserved in affordability. But I do want to thank all of you for joining us today and for thoughtful discussion. We are grateful to all our speakers and to the municipal partners who partnered with us on this project and who are supporting and doing the good work of creating and supporting affordable housing and supporting the residents who rely on these units. Our hope is that this resource guide will provide some clarity and practical tools to support administration. This is the beginning of a shared sort of effort, and we look forward to building upon this work in the months ahead. Also to note that the recording of this webinar and slides will be linked on the webpage, the LAU Resource Guide, in a couple of days. So you should be able to access all the slides that the speakers used. And we thank you again for your participation today. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah, can I just mention, I'm sorry, I meant to say this before, right? So MHP is going to be offering a online LIP LAU training session also January 15th at noon. So look for that from their community services department.
Great.
Thanks, Liz.
With that, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.